Hey Skyfarers, Arcanite Admiral here to talk to you all about Grundstok Thunderers. Specifically, how should you build these guys? Should you be using all the rifles? Should you be using the special weapons? Because that's a common question that I see lots of people new to Kharadron Overlords asking, so I thought I'd do a video on it. In this video, I'm going to cover the actual options available to you when you're building your Grundstok Thunderers, explaining how that works. I'm going to talk about how effective these weapons are, and then how they synergize potentially with the rest of your army, your battalions, your skyports, that sort of thing, and how that can affect your play style, and to help you decide, which one will suit you best. And if that's not enough to help you decide, then I've got some tips on how to magnetize them. And then also, if you don't like magnetizing, because I know a lot of people don't, I've got some suggested unit constructions for different, like a build template for, varying quantities of Thunderers. So, your first 10, your first 15, basically how I suggest you should build them to maximize your flexibility so that you don't pigeonhole yourself into, one option when you might want to try out more than one. So without further ado, let's take a look. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. First of all, the TLDR of this video, which is rifles for when you're in the ships and mixed weapons when you're on the ground. That is the common advice you will get on Facebook, Discord, WhatsApp, that sort of thing, Reddit, wherever you're asking. In your shop, if you ask, someone else that plays Kharadron, that's probably what they tell you. And that's right 90% of the time, but it's a little bit disingenuous to someone that maybe doesn't know anything about how the army works, because if you read that, I don't know, to use a common phrase, rules as written, if you took this as gospel, how it's written, then you think, oh, right, okay, well, the rifle guys will always be in the ships and mixed weapon guys will never go in the ships. Well, that's not entirely true. The mixed weapon guys, to really get the best use out of them, you probably need to put them in a ship first, have the ship move somewhere and then get them out, because most of the mixed weapons have 12-inch range. So if you deploy them on the ground in your deployment zone, your turn one, they'll walk forwards 4 inches because they're dwarfs and they're slow, and then shoot 12 inches. They ain't going to be shooting anything. Conversely, rifles, you could potentially foot slog them if you wanted to, because 18-inch range means in roughly half the battle plans, first you would be able to shoot something. In either case, foot slogging completely is not necessarily a good option, because the whole shtick of Kharadron Overlords is having boats to transport your stuff, and what really makes Kharadron Overlords powerful is being able to use your ships to move your troops around. So actually what this is saying is rifles for in the ships, because they will stay in the ships 100% of the time or 90% of the time, and mixed weapons for when on the ground, because they will go somewhere in a ship, then get out, and then once they're out of the ship after having gone somewhere in the ship, then they probably won't get back in again. Okay, so if all of that is sounding maybe a little bit confusing, you haven't even looked at the war score yet, or you looked at it, oh, that's a lot of profiles. Let's dial it back a little bit and start from the beginning. So how complicated can it be building your Grundstok Thunderers? Well, here's two examples of legal units. So on the left there, you've got a unit of rifles, and then on the right there, you've got a unit of mixed weapons. So both of them are examples of mixed units, but you could actually do combinations halfway in between this, multiple, and then this is only a unit of 5. So once you get up to units of 10, 15, 20, there's even more permutations of options. So there's a lot of different choices you can make, and the more choices you can make, then the more complicated it is. So let's start very basic and explain this. This is an Aethercast rifle. An Aethercast rifle has 18-inch range, 2 attacks, hits on 3s, wounds on 4s, -1 red and 1 damage, which is fairly decent for a shooting unit. It's medium to long range, got rend, and once you've got a decent number of them in a unit, weight of numbers that starts to add up, that 1 damage. It's not massively powerful. It's not like the best shooting unit in the game by any means, but it's not bad. And then let's move over to the special weapons. So let's start with this guy. That is an Aetheric Fumigator. It's basically a fart gun. It shoots out gas. It has a 9-inch range, which is very important because when you fly high ship, it has to land more than 9 inches away from enemy units. So when you're more than 9 inches away and have 9-inch range guns, you ain't shooting nothing, son. Sorry. But it has 3 attacks, hits on freeze, wounds on freeze, -1 rend, and 1 damage. So that is overall a better profile than a rifle in terms of damage output. 50% more attacks and more likely to wound, and the same damage and rend. Moving on. It has an ability as well, I should say, but I'll cover that in a minute. Moving on. This is a deck sweeper. It's basically like a shotgun. It's got 5 barrels, 12-inch range, 4 attacks. I'll explain why it has 4 attacks with 5 barrels in a minute. But yeah, 4 attacks, 12-inch range, hits on 4s, wounds on 4s, -1 rend and 1 damage. So again, that's going to do slightly more damage than a rifle because it's less likely to hit, but you've got double the number of attacks. So the double the number of attacks more than makes up for it. And there's an ability that makes it better to hit, which I'll talk about in a minute. This cool looking gun here is called an Aether Cannon. It's basically a bazooka. You can see it's got a big blast shield there that the Duardin holding it has to have to protect him from the sheer damage it can do. It's got 12-inch range, 1 attack, hits on 4s, wounds on 2s, -2 rend and D3 damage. So it's a little bit swingy because it hits on 4s and 1 attack. So half the amount of time you ain't going to do anything at all. But -2 rend, wounding on 2s, D3 damage. Once you do hit, you're likely to do damage. And like the deck sweeper, there's ways to improve its chances of hitting. This little guy on the bottom left, he's got a Grundstok mortar, which is basically like a grenade launcher. And you would be forgiven for expecting that to have long range, but because it's a mortar, mortars you'd think fire long distances, but it doesn't. It's got 12-inch range. And let's be honest, this gun is a little bit pants. 1 attack, hits on 4s, wounds on 3s, no rend, and D3 damage. So yeah, it's basically the worst of the bunch. It does have a way to improve its chances of hitting, but it's the least damage dealing of all of them. But there is a reason you might want to take it, which I'll get into in a minute. But you've got all these different weapon options. So how many of these guns and that can you actually take? And the easiest way I think to explain this is my next slide. So you see these 4 boxes I've got here. Right, you can't cross the boxes, okay? You can't go from one box to another. So in a unit of Thunderers, 1 model out of 5 can replace its Aether shot rifle with an Aether cannon. So this guy here can swap that gun for this gun. But he can't swap his gun for this gun or this gun or this gun. Okay? And same thing for the mortar. 1 model in 5 can take the mortar. So this guy here can swap that gun for the mortar, but he can't swap it for a cannon, a deck sweeper, or a fumigator. And the same for another guy, like a 3rd guy in the unit can swap his Aether shot rifle for a deck sweeper, and then a 4th guy in the unit can swap his rifle for a fumigator. So essentially, in a unit of 5, you could take this gun, this gun, this gun, this gun, and then the 5th guy would have one of these. But you couldn't have 4 of these, or 4 of these, or 4 of these, or these. You can't do that. You could have 4 rifles and 1 cannon if you wanted, or you could have 3 rifles and a cannon and an X-sweeper if you wanted to. You can basically pick and choose from these boxes which ones you want to take. Either none of them, one of them, 2 of them, 3 of them, 4 of them for a unit of 5. But you can't take more than one in the same box. If you go to larger units, then it's 1 in 5. So your unit of 10, you can take 2 Aether cannons, but you still can't take more than 2. But you can still take 1 Aether cannon if you wanted. Unit 20, you could take up to 4 Aether cannons, but you could take 4 Aether cannons and 4 mortars and 4 deck sweepers and 4 fumigators in unit 20 if you wanted to. Or you could take 4 Aether cannons and the rest rifles if you wanted to. Or you could take 4 Aether cannons, 1 mortar, and the rest rifles if you wanted to. That's how it works, okay? So they're the guns. Talk very briefly about their damage profiles and what you can select. But are they all the options available to you? Well, no. You can also have a gunnery sergeant in the unit. So one model in the unit can be the gunnery sergeant. He's the leader of the unit. So if you've got a unit of 5, you can have 1. If you've got a unit of 20, you can still only have 1 gunnery sergeant. He is armed with an 8-shot rifle, but look, he's got 2 little holes at the end of his rifle because he's got a double-barreled rifle. His rifle does twice as many attacks as a normal rifle. So the normal rifle has 2 attacks. This has 4 attacks, and then everything else is the same. So it's still 18-inch range, hits on 3s, wounds from 4s, -1 rend and 1 damage. So yeah, there's really no downside to taking him in a unit, because in a unit of rifles, you could either have 5 guys all with 2 attacks, or you can have 4 guys with 2 attacks and 1 guy with 4 attacks. What are you going to pick? I have the option with more attacks, please. Thank you very much. And then the same applies to if you have as many of the special weapons as you wanted. Because there's only 4 special weapons, so you'd still have a 5th guy left over, which would have a rifle. So why not have a guy with a rifle with twice as many attacks? No brainer, really. Okay, so he's got a little feathered friend, this little parrot on his shoulder. That is actually called a drill bill. What the drill bill does is, narratively, it flies off around the unit to protect the unit when they get attacked, and peck at the eyes of the enemy and that sort of thing. How that's represented in game is a melee weapon profile, purely for the sergeant, which is 3-inch range because it flies off. D3 attacks, hits and 4s, wounds and 4s, -1 rend and 1 damage. So, I mean, that's not bad, but let's be honest, I should have mentioned this a minute ago. This is not a melee unit. This is a shooting unit. All of these guys do get a melee attack. Every model in the unit can basically club people over the head with their guns. It's written on the wall scrolls, hitting them with the gun, but basically it's 1 attack each, 4s and 4s, no rend, 1 damage. So not going to be doing anything. You add the drill bill into the mix, the sergeant gets the drill bill as well as the gun butt, but it basically just means the sergeant means that you can maybe do 1 damage in you can reliably almost do 1 damage when you're in combat. But that's it. It doesn't make it into a melee unit. It's a nice little bonus to have. Not going to complain about, but doesn't transform the unit in any way at all. Okay, moving on to what I have here on the right, the standard bearer or honor bearer. So basically, 1 in 5 models in the unit can be an honor bearer. So you model them with this standard here with an honor stone in the middle, which honors the ancestors. And what that does is it allows the unit to reroll Battle Shock. So that's okay. It's not amazing. You've got ways to make your units Battle Shock immune if you want to, but Bravery 7, again, not bad. And it's not demons or undead models quality, 10, but it's better than Arcanauts, and it's better than some destruction models that are like Bravery 4 and stuff. So, an ability to reroll Battle Shock for free is okay. And all these guys have 2 wounds. So if anyone runs away, it's like taking 2 damage, essentially. So potentially stopping models from running away is good. You don't want to have these guys running away, really. So it's decent ability. The way this works is it glues, like here, onto the backpack, and all of the backpacks actually have it's like a little stepped section to help it have more surface area to glue rather. And all of them have that. So you can actually put it on any model. So it's pictured here on a rifle guy, but you could put it on your sergeant up there if you want to. Or if you've got a fumigator guy, you can put it on him. Or you can put it on an Aether cannon guy. Typically what I recommend is you want your sergeant to have one, because when you're taking when you're allocating wounds to a unit, you get to choose which units die and which units don't. You don't want, if you've got a unit of 5 guys all with rifles, you don't want your sergeant to die because he has more attacks. You want one of the other guys to die. So you don't want to when you get to the point where there's only 2 guys left, you don't necessarily want the sergeant to die. You also don't want the standard bearer to die. So make them the same guy. And then also, if you're running mixed weapons, you might want to put it on the Aether cannon guy, because that's a very good gun. Or you might want to put, if you're running a larger unit, 1 on each of the weapons, for reasons I'll get into later. But typically, you're going to put it on the guys that you want to keep in the unit after when you start allocating wounds, you don't want to put it on the ones that you're going to want to take out. And you're going to want to, when you play in the unit, think about where your models are. So you want, you don't want your standard bearer out on an edge of a string or something, because then when you won't want to take him away. But if you take away all the models in unit consistency with him, then he would then have to be taken off anyway. So you're going to want to think about your positioning there to make sure your standard bearers are positioned in the middle of the unit. Okay, so they're the options available to you, really. Let's talk about some of the abilities these things have, because it's not just about the damages they have. So the whole unit has an ability called Drive Them Back, and it basically is this top one here. So it basically is, if the unit is within 3 inches of an enemy unit, you get +1 attack. Now, a couple of important things about this ability. Doesn't work if you're in a garrison. So if an enemy unit charges your ship and the Thunderers are inside the ship, you don't get +1 attack. You have to be outside of the ship. Okay. The second most important thing about this is sequencing. So you have to be within 3 inches of an enemy unit to get +1 attack, and it's for your missile weapons. So, okay. Age of Sigma works like this. You do your hero phase, then you do your movement phase. When you move, you can't move within 3 inches of an enemy. You can't walk up to them and get within 3 inches of them. Okay? And if you start within 3 inches of them and then you move, you have to end that move 3 inches away. And then the shooting phase happens after that. So you can't walk up to them, walk within 3 inches and get +1 attack. So there, shooting phase happens then, and then the way you can get within 3 inches of enemy units is charging, but charging happens after shooting, so that doesn't happen. So what this ability really does is it means that if your opponent charges you, like an enemy unit charges your Thunderers and they're not in a ship, and you survive that combat, which is important. You have to survive. Like if they kill your unit, it doesn't matter, does it? You're not getting +1 attack to 0 models. Yes, you have to survive that combat, and then if your turn is next, and you don't retreat, then in your shooting unit you get +1 attack. So this basically makes up for the fact that you don't have very good melee attacks. It makes up for clugging people over the top with the guns. Means that when you're in combat with an enemy unit, you can do a bit more damage in your turn. And it also incentivizes you to not retreat, because you can get more shots. And actually, if you retreated, you won't get to shoot anyway. So it makes you want to stand fast and shoot, basically. Talked briefly about rifles a minute ago. Long-ish, medium to long range, 18-inch is good. They typically do less damage than the other options available to you, but you get that longer range. And they are easier to roll, which is not an insignificant thing for Thunderers. You don't normally think about, oh, I'm going to build models with a certain type of weapon just because it's easier to roll. That's not very often a consideration, but it can be with Thunderers, because if you've got a unit with all rifles, okay, and you'll have a sergeant, but the sergeant just has extra attacks, so it's just more dice, but everything else is the same. So you can roll his attacks with him. You just roll all your dice once, done. Okay. If you've got a mixture of rifles, mortars, cannons, deck sweepers, and fumigators, then you'll go, right, well, I'm going to attack that unit. Okay, I'm going to roll all my rifles, and then you'll make a note of how much damage you've done. Then you'll roll all your cannons, make a note of how much damage you've done with them. Roll all your mortars, make a note of how much damage you've done there. Then the same for the deck sweeper, the same again for the fumigator. Then you add up that total at the end, all the damage done at the end, and your opponent will allocate the wounds to the target unit, which can be quite time consuming. Okay, so that's something you might want to consider. If you know you're typically a slow player, you might want to opt for rifles. Or, if you're very new to playing the army, you might want to start out with rifles just because it's easier to do. You've got less profiles to manage, and then you can do your rifles, and then once you've got to know the army a bit better, then you can move on to the mixed weapons. Maybe, generally speaking, the mixed weapons are more powerful. So if we look at the mortar, the cannon, the deck sweeper, they all have 12-inch range, and they all have an ability called pin them, shred them, and finish them. What that ability does, it again does not work in a garrison, so it doesn't work if you're in a ship. But if you've got at least one each of these weapons, then you get +1 to hit rolls for attacks made by those weapons. So if you've got a unit of 5 models with 1 mortar, 1 cannon, 1 deck sweeper, then all of those get +1 to hit. So the cannon goes from 4s and 2s to 3s and 2s. The mortar goes from 4s and 3s to 3s and 3s, and the deck sweeper goes from 4s and 4s to 3s and 4s. Now, it's a decent buff, and that's why you want to take a mortar if you're running the mixed weapons, because if you don't have the mortar, you won't get this buff. You need to have at least one of each, and you need to have at least one of each at the time you're making those attacks. So it doesn't matter if you started the game with one of each. If you allocate wounds, and then that means you haven't got a mortar anymore, then your next turn you won't be able to get that +1 to hit buff. Okay. One thing to mention about this is, we talked about ease of rolling a minute ago. Now, the deck sweepers normally hit on 4s and wound of 4s. They're -1 rend and 1 damage, and the rifle is hits on 3s, wounds on 4s, -1 rend and 1 damage. The rifle doesn't get +1 to hit, so the rifle will always be 3s and 4s. The deck sweeper, once you've got +1 to hit, will be 3s and 4s. So if you've got a mixed weapon unit, you will have rifles in the unit, because there's 1 in 5 that can't take a special weapon. So that means that you can roll the rifles and the deck sweepers at the same time if you're targeting the same unit with them, which is helpful to speed things up a little bit. Okay, and last but not least, the fumigator I mentioned earlier, it has its own special ability. Well, and I also mentioned about the 9-inch range being significant. And yeah, that's because it has its own really cool ability, which is enemy models that are within 3 inches of any models with a fumigator must subtract 1 from hit rolls. Again, this does not work in a garrison. So the guy with the fumigator is in a ship, this ability doesn't do anything. But if you're not in a ship and an enemy unit charges your unit of Thunderers, any models that are within 3 inches of the fumigator have got to take -1 from the hit rolls, which helps make your unit more survivable. So this ability for the fumigator and this ability synergise, because one ability makes the unit more survivable, and the other one is basically an ability that you don't get to use unless you just survive some attacks. So that's that. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about some synergies and drawbacks now we've started talking about these. So rifles, we mentioned with the TLDR that they are mostly using ships, and part of that is because there's no drawback to them being a ship. We mentioned all those abilities a minute ago that don't work if you're in a ship, or rifles aren't affected by any of those abilities except for the +1 attack. So they don't really have a drawback to being in a ship, unlike the other special weapons. Okay, and that 18-inch range is significant because if you land more than 9 inches away from your enemy unit, then the enemy unit is probably going to make a screen, and then a hero or a hammer unit is going to be further back than that unit. Now, the mortars, cannon, and deck sweepers all have 12-inch range, so if they're 9 inches from an enemy unit, then they can only reach 3 inches beyond the front of that enemy unit. So if an enemy hero is 3.5 inches behind their screen, the mortar and the cannon deck sweeper can't shoot them, but the rifles can. So the rifles can bounce around in the ships and shoot past screens, which is helpful. Or they can, fly high and the ship can land a bit further away, which means it's a little bit safer. It's a bit further away and you can shoot from further back. So the rifles are really good in the ship. And as I mentioned earlier in the TLDR, they potentially can foot slog if you want to. I don't think that's the best thing to do in Kharadron Overlords. There's maybe some play in that either in a custom skyport or Barrack Mornar, because in both of those have an option, an ability for you to run and shoot in the first turn. So 4-inch range, 4-inch movement, 6-inch run, 18-inch range shooting, then you're, got 28-inch range then with the rifles. So it's worth considering if you're thinking about playing Barrack Mornar. You might want to consider rifles maybe if you want to use Thunderers. Moving on to the mortar, the cannon, the deck sweeper, they really benefit from Barrack Zilfin. So to summarize this unit, they've got a very high potential for damage, but they're only 12-inch range, and they don't want to be in a boat because their main ability doesn't work in a boat. So what you can do with Barrack Zilfin is you can fly high in the hero phase once per game, and then they will get out in the movement phase. So you're 9 inches away after flying high. You'll get out. You can get out up to 6 inches away, and more than 3 inches from enemy unit. So then they will just get out and be sitting 3 inches away from an enemy unit, and then they will unload with all their guns, which will now have +1 to hit because you're not inside a ship anymore. And Barrack Zilfin also gets around that issue I mentioned a minute ago about the range, because normally if you fly a higher ship and you've got these guns, you can only shoot 3 inches beyond the screen, but if you're 3 inches from the screen, you can shoot 9 inches beyond the screen, which is a huge difference, really. And then moving on to the Fumigator. The Fumigator also doesn't really want to be in a boat because its ability doesn't work in a boat, and 9-inch range. So again, the Fumigator really works well with Zilfin, again, because can't shoot at all normally if you fly high, but if you fly high and then he gets out and it's 3 inches away, then he is in range to shoot stuff. Okay. As I mentioned on the previous screen, he makes the unit more survivable. So if you're running the mortar cannon deck sweeper, then it's handy to have some fumigators, because if you get out of a ship and you're 3 inches away from enemy units, you're likely to end up being in combat, and therefore you want them to be able to survive a bit more, so -1 to hit is good. And the Fumigator also stacks with an ability the Chemist has, basically the same as the Fumigator's ability, but with a different name. So if you have a unit of Thunderers with a couple of Fumigators in, you'll put them in a nice little tight circle, and then you'll stick a Chemist in the middle, and then anything that charges that unit, if the models are within 3 inches of a Chemist and a Fumigator, they'll be -2 to hit. Which then a -2 to hit is relatively survivable, actually, especially when you've got 2 wounds each. A 20-man unit will be 40 wounds. It's going to be hard to kill. Obviously, stuff like exploding sixes or sixes do mortal wounds, or enemy shooting, or spells are still going to be hurting your Thunderers, but they will be more survivable in melee for the most part. Okay, so you're getting an idea of, you typically always go for rifles for range, and flexibility, and moving around in the ships, or mixed weapons for just basically sitting on a point and blasting stuff. Okay, let's look at some math. Now, I don't want to go into all the details on this too much, but you can see here the basic rifle, that's how powerful it is. If you compare it to the sergeant's rifle, double the damage because double the amount of attacks. Fumigator does the same amount of damage as the sergeant's rifle, roughly. Deck sweeper, a little bit stronger than the rifle. The rifle will be here, so it's about, it's a third more, or 50% more powerful. And the Aether cannon is a little bit more powerful again, but not as powerful as the sergeant's rifle, the double shot rifle, or the fumigator. And the mortar, pretty rubbish, really. Only a little bit worse than the rifle, but the lower range, no rend, I think, really lets it down a bit. And then you can see here how bad the gun bat is and how insignificant really the drill bit is. Now, let's talk about buffs. So, pin them, shred them, finish them. For the deck sweeper, Aether cannon, mortar gives +1 to hit. So, you can see here for the deck sweeper, makes it a little bit more powerful. Again, the Aether cannon adds a little bit more extra power, not a huge amount, but it brings it in line with like the sergeant's double shot rifle, the fumigator, and the mortar helps a little bit, but not much. Now, the other ability that I mentioned a minute ago was if you're in combat, you get +1 to attack. So the rifle gets this one as well. So that makes the rifle 50% more powerful because it's 2 attacks, it goes to 3 attacks. Makes the sergeant's rifle the same amount more powerful than a rifle, but percentage-wise, it's less of a difference. So gives it a boost. Makes it, it's already one of the best guns, so it makes it really good. Fumigator gets a slightly bigger boost. Deck sweeper gets a small boost because it normally has 4 attacks, so 1 extra attack doesn't make a huge amount of difference. The Aether cannon, wow, look at that. That's a huge boost. That it doubles its damage and makes it, once in combat, the Aether cannon is your most powerful gun. And it's also actually a sizable boost for the mortar, brings it in line with a rifle then. Once you're in combat, the rifle and the mortar do relatively the same amount of damage, and that's something to consider when you're allocating wounds to a unit. Because if you're in combat, you're going to be allocating wounds to a unit. So typically what I would say is early on in the game, you will want to be potentially allocating wounds to rifles or maybe the mortar if you've got more than one mortar. And later on in the game, you'll definitely want to be putting them on the rifles. There's 2 things to consider here, which is if you've only got one mortar and you allocate wounds to it and you lose it, then obviously you lose the +1 to hit buff for your deck sweeper and your Aether cannon. If you allocate too many wounds to rifles, then you might then next turn kill what you're in combat with, but then you could be sitting 20 inches away from another target. So then the turn after that, if you've only got deck sweepers, Aether cannons, and mortars left, you ain't going to be shooting anything. So that's another thing to consider. You might want to plan ahead when you're allocating wounds and think, well, look, I'll do more damage if I allocate wounds to my rifles, but I can actually probably still kill the unit if I allocate wounds to my deck sweepers and stuff. So it might be better to save my rifle so I can do some shooting in a couple of turns' time. Okay. Last but not least, the blue here is if you're in combat and have the +1 to hit from pin them, shred them, finish them. Look at how much damage the Aether cannon does there. That is huge. It basically makes it like worth 2 and a bit rifles, like 2 and a third rifles. Makes it really powerful, basically. There's not much else more to say about that. I just wanted to show you visually how much damage extra you get from the different buffs and the different weapons, so you can get an idea. So it's because it's one thing saying, it's more powerful, but if it's more, there's a big difference between being, it's, you get 5% extra more power compared to, you get, 3 times as much power. So this gives you an idea. of how much extra power you get from the different weapon options and then from the different scenarios of buffs. So you can see really you can be very Aether cannons in combat with +1 to hit just do a huge amount of damage. Okay, that's not all. I've got more math for you, but I don't want to go into too much detail. What this shows is the amount of damage a 10-man unit does for different weapon options at different ranges. So green, 18-inch range, gold is 12-inch range, and red is basically 9-inch range, or you're in combat. So if you're in combat, you can only shoot the unit you're in combat with. So there's a few things to look at here, which is, I mean, let's look at our baseline, which is all rifles, 4.88 damage on average. And that's, without any penalties. So even without penalties, they probably can't kill a 5-wound hero. But, once you factor in penalties and, you've got ships doing some shooting as well, then, you fly high somewhere, then you might be able to take out a small 5-wound hero with the ship shooting and the rifles combined. The main thing to look at here is as your damage increases, you get slightly more damage depending on the weapons you take. So if you start adding fumigators in, you get more damage. If you start adding in the mixed weapons, you get more damage. Or if you have mixed weapons and fumigators, you do even more damage. But what happens is, look at this little green triangle gets smaller. So the more damage your unit does, the less you do at range. Okay. And then the other thing is all these little peaks here. There's a peak here, here. These are, the weapon options again, but in combat. So what you can see is that there's a noticeable peak. It doesn't matter what type of weapons you got, you will see a peak if you're in combat. And if we look right at the bottom here, the most powerful you can make a unit of Thunderers is if they've got mixed weapons and fumigators and they're in combat, and they're getting their +1 to hit buff, and it does more than double the amount of damage as all rifles. So it's almost like having a 480 point unit for the price of a 240 point unit, which is something to consider. But of course, you won't be getting that every turn, which is another thing to consider. So that's really what I want to show you with this slide is how much difference it makes being in combat and how there's a trade-off for range. Okay, let's now look at some common units that people use, unit constructions. So 10-man units, you'll typically see either all rifles, so you might see a unit with 1 sergeant and 9 rifles, or maybe 1 sergeant, 8 rifles and a fumigator. The token fumigator being like a little bit of an option for you because you're getting to turn 3 or 4, you might then want to drop them out onto a objective, and it just means that if you do get charged, you don't really want them to get charged, but if you do, that makes them a bit more survivable. But you're only taking 1 fumigator because you don't want to decrease your ranged output when you're flying high, because maybe you want to get 3 or maybe 4 turns of flying high and shooting with the Thunderers. Okay, and then the second sort of option you see with 10-man units is mixed weapon units. Now, important thing to note with both these versions I've got here is only 1 mortar. So you get 2 deck sweepers and 2 Aether cannons, because the mortar you need there to pin them, shred them, finish them, +1 to hit buff, but it's a pretty rubbish gun. So what you do is you just take 1, just enough to buff these weapons. And then the 2 variations here I've got are just different numbers of fumigators. So 1 doesn't have fumigators and 1 does. I would say you probably want to go with fumigators if you're running mixed weapons, particularly if you're doing it in Zilfan, where you're definitely getting out turn 1. But the trade-off here is how many rifles you have, and therefore how much ranged output you have. Because in this left-hand version with no fumigators, you've got 12 attacks at 18-inch range, and in the left-hand version, you've got 8 attacks. So when swapping 2 fumigating, you lose a third of your long range attacks basically. So you might see 10-man units, in a frigate, and there might be like a dirigible suit engine master flying around with them to give them reroll ones to hit, or they might be in escort wing, which I should have mentioned with the synergies actually. Escort wing would allow them to reroll all failed hits against one enemy target at turn, which would be very helpful. It's a big buff. And then the mixed weapon units, you'd be, dropping them out. So you'd be running, say, potentially 10-man unit in a ironclad and then flying high in Zilfin and dropping it out with a chemist. Or you could be running, say, this left-hand unit in escort wing in a frigate if you wanted to. Or you could run 2 units of 10 in an ironclad with the ebullient buoyancy aid if you wanted to. And if you were going to run 2 units of 10, you would probably run either 2 mixed weapon units or 1 unit with all rifles and 1 with mixed weapons. The idea being you'd fly high somewhere in the hero phase, the mixed weapon unit would get out, and then the unit of rifles would stay in the ship to go elsewhere later on. Okay, moving on from 10-man units, 15-man units are less common, and that's because of the capacities of ships. So a frigate, if it has 15 models in it, it can't fly high. Any more than 10, it's buggered. An ironclad, it can have 15 in it and still fly high or move at full speed, but then you can't have a hero in it. So you could take a unit of 15 in an ironclad in escort wing and just fly high with either 15 Thunderers with all rifles, one of them obviously be a sergeant, or 15 mixed weapon unit. Again, only 1 mortar in a mixed weapon unit. And, blast stuff away. Or in Zilfin, you could drop them out. But if you're going to drop them out, you probably want a chemist there, because then you can stack it with the fumigators, make them -2 to hit. You can do a sneaky thing with an ironclad. You can take a unit of 14, and this is called an under-strength unit. Now, it's actually considered a little bit gamey, okay? So maybe not something you want to do in casual games, but if you take an under-strength unit, then you could take a unit of 14 Thunderers and a chemist in an ironclad, and a hero. Doesn't matter which hero it is. The chemist is good if you want to get them out because of the -1 to hit, but any hero will be able to give them reroll 1s to hit with a command ability, for instance, and it would be cheaper than having a dirigible suit bouncing around the ship because he's the points of 2 heroes. Important thing to know about under-strength units is an under-strength unit cannot be in a battalion, and you can only have 1 under-strength unit in an army of that type of unit. So you could have an under-strength unit of Arcanauts and an under-strength unit of Thunderers, but you couldn't have 2 under-strength units of Thunderers. Okay. And the other important thing to note about an under-strength unit, if you did take 14, you want to do this sneaky thing with a hero, is the 1 in 5 rule for the Aether cannons and deck sweepers. Well, if you've got 10 and then you've got 4, which isn't another 5. So if you were going to take a mixed weapon unit for a 14-man unit, you would only be able to have 2 Aether cannons and 2 deck sweepers and 2 fumigators. Okay? But it would kind of be, you could take basically what would be one of these loadout from a 10-man unit and then just add in more rifles, really. It's very uncommon, though. It's not something you see very often. What is more common, actually, and probably the most common to see, is 20 Thunderers in 1 big unit in a ship. They're going an ironclad, and you choose the brilliant buoyancy aid that I mentioned earlier, because an ironclad can normally only carry 15 models and still be able to fly high, but the buoyancy aid means it can still fly high at full capacity, which is 25 models. So you could take a unit of 20 models and a hero or a couple of heroes and fly high, And yeah, you can do that. And if you were going to do that, you would typically do it with a mixed weapon unit in Zilfin, and it's what people refer to as the Kron car, or the Thunderer drop, named after Alexander Kron, one of our co-hosts here on Aethercast. And it's just a really powerful combo because you'll fly high in Zilfin, drop out 20 Thunderers, and then blast away essentially with a huge unit doing a lot of damage. And it's very powerful, but it is also a lot of eggs in one basket. 480 points of Thunderers there, and 480 points of Ironclad to deliver them, and you have to use an engine work to make it work. So there's a lot going into that combo. If you want to see more about how that works, you can check out one of our interviews with Kron about one of his tournaments that he's been to where he did well, or check out our Barrack Zilfin navigating the skyports episode. Okay, so I've talked on now for 45-ish minutes about all these different options and how they work. Hopefully now you've got an idea of how you can build Thunderers, make them work in a list, and to get the most out of them. And hopefully that's given you sort of an idea of what will work for your playstyle, whether you want to be more flexible, shooting from distance, or whether you want to just sit in front of someone and hit them as hard as you can. And hopefully now you can make some decisions on what you want to do. Maybe you're still a bit undecided. Now, if you're still a bit undecided, maybe you're thinking, oh, should I be using magnets? Now, of course, I know not everybody likes magnets. Some people love them. Some people are like, oh, no, that's scary. I've got to use drills and drill into models and things. Don't want to do that. So that's fair enough. I've got some tips here if you do like magnets, and then after that, I've got some suggestions of what to do if you're still unsure about what to do but don't like magnets. So if you do like magnets, some general hobby tips. Let's start first of all. When you're magnetizing a Thunderer, you only need to magnetize the shoulder. The right arm is all one bit normally, which is the arm and the gun is one bit, and then the left arm is one bit as well that glues to the left shoulder, and then it's got a little bit that goes inside the gun. So if that left arm is glued, you can actually push the gun and just dry fit it onto the left arm, and it can actually almost pretty much hold it in place, but it's not very secure. So you need the magnets really just in the right shoulder to hold it in place. You don't need to magnetize the left arm at all. You can do it, but it's a little bit more work, to be honest, and costs you more money because there's more magnets. Now, when you're magnetizing them, blue tack is your friend here, because especially if you're going to do the method I just described where you don't magnetize the left arm, you need to get that left arm glued in place in the right place. So what you need to do is blue tack the right arm with a very, very small amount of blue tack. Don't want too much. Blue tack the right arm in position in the correct place, and then use that to get the left arm in the correct position and glued. And then once you've done that, you can, drill your holes for your magnets in the shoulder and glue those in. Last thing as a general hobby tip is the pipes. There are pipes that go from the gun to the backpack. Now, when you're positioning the gun, of course, you need the backpack either glued in place or blue tacked in place so you can get the right arm in the correct position to get the pipes to match up. Now, that's doable. It's a little bit fiddly. If you just want to get it done and you want it to just be quick, cut the pipes off. Easy to do. You can either cut the pipe off and there's a little bulgy bit on both the backpack and the end of the gun. You can either cut those bits off as well. Or what I did was on mine is I smoothed them over a bit and made them like a little glowy Aetheric gold, but my Aether gold, like glowy power orb type thing. Green on my models. I did that. Some other tips are stick to the easier ones to magnetize. So the fumigator is difficult to magnetize because I said about how they all have the right arm is the arm and the gun. Well, on the fumigator, the right arm is separate. So there's a little triangle bit, or basically from the elbow to the shoulder, and you only get one of that bit. So when you want to do the fumigator, you actually need to glue that bit to the model, not to the gun. Whereas normally, if you were following the instructions and gluing the unit, you would glue the that little bit of arm to the gun. But you're going to do it the opposite way around here, and so then you've got to use blue tack it to the gun to get it in the right position for when you glue it, and then it doesn't have a flat surface to drill into for the magnets, particularly on the gun bits. So fumigator is a little bit more difficult. So if you've got something like Thunderous Profiteers, then use that to make a fumigator, because then you haven't got a magnet. That's one less fumigator to magnetize, which is the most difficult one. You don't really need to magnetize the standards, because you get you'll put one on the sergeant. You're always going to have a sergeant in the unit, whether you're running rifles or mixed weapons. And then if you just think about which weapons you're putting them on, then like if you put it on the guy that's magnetized to the Aether cannon, then that's great. You don't need to magnetize that one. Then you don't need to magnetize it, so you can then put it on any model you want to. It's just more work. Don't need to do it. Okay. Also, I wouldn't bother magnetizing the drill bill. I think the main thing to look that people will recognize for the sergeant is the double-barreled gun, and that's the main thing. If you've got a guy there and he's got a normal rifle and a drill bill, you just say, oh yeah, he's not the sergeant, so he's not getting the drill bill attacks. Don't worry about that. And he's got one, he's got the single-barreled rifle, because the drill bill's not very easy to magnetize. It doesn't have a very large surface. It's only got the little robot feet. And lastly, only do what's necessary. So you're probably never going to run more than 20 Thunderers in a list, to be honest. If you do, you're going to be running 1 unit of 20 or 2 units of 10. So you only need to magnetize one sergeant if you are going to magnetize a sergeant, because you always have one, at least one. So you don't go magnetizing 4 sergeants because you've done, I've got 4 units here because I've got 20 models. No, just do one. And you're only ever going to need one, maybe 2 mortars, because you're only going to do. You're either going to run 1 unit of 20 mixed weapons, or you might run 1 unit of 1 unit of 10 mixed weapons and 1 unit of 10 rifles, or 2 units of 10 mixed weapons. In which case, then you might want a second mortar. But don't go and magnetize 4 mortars because you're making yourself extra work you don't need to do. Okay, what if you don't like magnets? So if you don't like magnets, got some suggested builds for you. So I suggest starting with rifles, because if you've been watching this video, you probably are new to Kharadron Overlords, and rifles are easier to get to play first of all. So start with rifles, and if you start with rifles, they will always be useful going forwards because you can extend them to be a unit of mixed weapons if you want to. And I don't think you need to start with 5. Don't ever just build 500s because they're pretty rubbish. Like, you're going to want to run at least a unit of 10 to make them viable, because then they get the rate for gold and stuff. So your first unit of 10, 1 gunnery sergeant with the honor bearer, the standard, 1 normal rifle with the standard, and then 8 normal rifles. And then if you've got Thunderous Profiteers, because you get a normal guy with a rifle in Thunderous Profiteers, also go check out my video about why Thunderous Profiteers is really good. Although unfortunately it seems like it's out of stock in most places now. But if you've got Thunderous Profiteers, you can build a fumigator, because that would be helpful going forward. And then I've got another option here, this option. Massive caveat on this option. Now, this option is for mostly if you're playing casual with your mates, or in a store that's a bit more laissez-faire. If you play in tournaments or places where it's what you see is what you get is very strict, then don't do this, okay? But you could build 2 gunnery sergeants, and that would be helpful going on. And if going forwards, then they both have standard bearers. And if you did that, you want to make one of them noticeably different to the other one. So here is my example. These are 2 of my Thunderers. You can see that, ignore the fact that one's got standard bearer and one hasn't, because the one on the right I actually bought second hand, and so he's already built, so I had to work around that. But yeah, ignore the standard bear, but you can see I've made the base really obvious. So all of my models in my army typically have this style basing, and then this guy's got a gold base. It's meant to be like molten gold, and I do have some sort of molten gold on some other bases, but typically for unit leaders, that helps make the unit leader stand out. And so if these two guys were ran in the same unit, or one unit of 10 Thunderers, it'd be very easy for my opponent, because I'd just say, yeah, that unit, that guy there with the gold base, he's the leader of the unit. And that's obvious. And even if he didn't have it explained to them, you can probably guess that the leader of the unit is the one with the gold base. Okay. So there's that. So if you do this, you want to do something very obvious. You could just do a very big rock that he's standing on, or something like that. But it needs to be obvious. It can't just be something like, oh, he's got a silver moustache and this one's got a gold moustache, because no one's going to remember that halfway through a game. Make it obvious, okay? But yeah, the TLDR of this is, if you want to play it safe, then ignore this option, okay? But stick with rifles to begin with. Your second build, you want to expand to 15. And what you do with this build is you build 2 Aether cannons, 2 deck sweepers, and 1 mortar. And one of the Aether cannons will have the honor bearer, the standard. What this does is it gives you then the option to either run, from your first build, you could run this. But then it gives you the option to run this. So 5 more models lets you play a completely different 10-man unit, because it lets you run all mixed weapons. So you'd have 1 sergeant with the standard, which is, the double barrel gun, 1 mortar, 2 Aether cannons, 2 deck sweepers, and 4 rifles, which is basically a mixed weapon unit. Not perfect because you haven't got a fumigator, but if you've got Thunderous Profiteers, then you can have a fumigator in the unit. Or if you wanted to, you could run a unit of 15, or do that sneaky thing I said earlier about the understrength unit with 14, because even though it's a unit of 15, you'd only have 2 Aether cannons and 2 deck sweepers, so you wouldn't be going over that, 1 in 5 limit. And again, you can put the fumigator in if you got it from Thunder, because you've got Thunderous Profiteers. Okay, so basically, expanding to 15 is not necessarily so much about playing a unit of 15. It's more about having 2 different choices for your unit of 10. Okay, when you expand to 20, this is where you want to make some decisions now, because the way you built up until now, you can play either a unit of 15, or you play a unit of 10 with mixed weapons, or a unit of 10 with raw rifles. So now you need to decide, is my primary goal here to go with a big unit of 20 mixed weapon Thunderers, in which case you will want to build 2 cannons, one of them with a standard, 2 deck sweepers, and 1 fumigator. And that will allow you to run 1 big unit of 20. Now, you could still run 2 units of 10 with this, because we talked about these sergeants. Now, the sergeant is actually optional, so you could still, you've only got 1 sergeant if you've done these builds, or depending on how you did it, on with the suggestion with 2 sergeants in your first 10. So you might have followed that, but you can still run a 2 legal units of 10 with 1 unit not having a sergeant. So you could still run 2 units of 10 with mixed weapons with this option here, but you would lose out on the drill bell and 2 attacks in one of your units for your rifles. Your other option is, if you really want to go down the 2 units of 10 route, and that's the decision you want to go down, then actually you're probably better having 1 unit of 10 rifles and 1 unit of 10 mixed weapons, in which case you want to either build an extra gunnery sergeant with the standard and 4 rifles, or if you've already built that gunnery sergeant earlier using the method I said, or you're not bothered about losing out on the 2 attacks, then you can build 4 rifles and a fumigator, because the fumigator will make your mixed weapon unit better. And so you can basically then, with this option, you can run 1 unit of 10 with rifles and 1 unit of 10 with the mixed weapons. And if you've got Thunderous Profiteers, then you will have also an extra fumigator in this unit here. Okay, so that's 20 models. Been talking for a while now. Last screen. Expanding to 25 models is something I do recommend doing if you're not magnetizing, because you can basically do the opposite to what you did on your, from going from 15 to 20. Yeah, you then almost do the opposite from going from 20 to 25. So if you did all rifles in your 15 to 20, then you'd then build two ape cannons, one with the standard, two Dex Reapers and a fumigator, and then that would give you the option of running the big 20-man unit with mixed weapons. Or if you did it the opposite way around before, where you built this when you went from 15 to 20, you could build one of these two options, as I just explained. Depending on what you're doing with the gunnery sergeant, which would then give you the option of running 2 units of 10, one with rifles, one with mixed weapons. And that basically means that from having 25 models, you've then got two very different ways of running up to 20 models, essentially. So that's it. That's all I've got to say about Thunderers. I think I've probably forgotten some things, but that's the way it is. Hopefully, I think people will have found this useful. If you have found this useful, please hit like and subscribe. If you've got, some specific questions, because, like me, you've got some secondhand models that were already built, and therefore, that means you can't follow these suggested builds, or, you want some more specific advice regarding that, then feel free to ask in the comments. If you've got any other questions, ask in the comments. Always happy to help. If you've got suggestions for future videos, leave a comment. But thank you very much for watching Skyfarers, and I will hopefully see you again soon.